the identification and encouragement of true quality. One can have therefore both quality and quantity, but it is subject to an important caveat. It is quality for a few with quantity for the many, with all contributing coherently to the progress of the nation. What I wish to affirm here is that without a broad-based sound education for vast numbers of people, there can be no hope ever of accurately identifying, nurturing and recognizing the high flyers. You need to educate a very large number at the base before you can start identifying who are the better people as you go up the pyramid. This again is, see, in the end it is only the high flyers that take a country forward. Nehru realized this, Bhabha recognized this, J.R.D. Tata recognized this. Very difficult for our political establishment today to accept this, that only the high flyers take the country forward. Very difficult for them to countenance, but they will have to contend with some basic scientific truths and some even more important human behavioral traits if they continue to obstinately defend many of their anachronistic policies and actions that almost seem to deny the existence of true quality. What is quality? Quality is something that should not be definable. You should be able to know what it is. It is the voice of M.S. Subbulakshmi. It is Michael Phelps getting 8 gold medals. It is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It's the Japanese flower arrangement. It's the giant temple in Srirangam or Tanjore. That is quality. What is common between all these things? We know what it, we don't have to define it. We know what quality is. So in summary, quantity comes first and then quality comes. But that can have a bit of both if you know what you are doing. Quantity does not mean loss of quality. Doesn't have to be. Quantity, however, is also no substitute for quality. You can't say that I will educate a lot of people, so it doesn't matter how I educate them. We need to nurture a system of scientific activity in developing countries where one can provide a decent education at lower levels to many students along with a high-class program of research at higher levels for a selected few. How then does quality research fit into a quantity-based system where everyone wants to study? Education must therefore evolve in 2 stages. In the first stage, a very large number of students must be given a sound undergraduate training in science. I am talking here about science. But you can substitute any other subject, including laboratory work. Laboratory work is very important in science. Without doing work in a lab, you don't do science at all. In the second stage, a smaller number of truly gifted individuals must be identified and given a world-class education. Simultaneously, those who terminate their education at the undergraduate level, and many should be encouraged to do so, should be provided with decent employment opportunities. A dignified exit option at all levels is a must. And here the operative word is dignified. This is what we don't have in our country. We don't have exit options in our educational setup. If identification and encouragement of quality is the true aim of a quantity-based system, 2 indispensable elements are required for its successful prosecution. The numbers of students processed at the lower levels must be really large. The thoroughness with which the system is able to identify and elevate quality must be highly efficient. Both points now require some elaboration. Why should the number of students at the lower levels be very large? A key assumption in the working of a quantity-based system is that the proportion of really talented individuals is always small and constant. So in a heavily populated country like ours, the total number of extremely talented individuals is substantial. I estimate that there are around 200 youngsters in the age group 16 to 17 with an IQ of greater than 140 in each district of this vast country. Now how do I get these numbers? I don't have the time to derive it over here, but they are all based on certain standard data which anybody can obtain from the internet. It has to do with how the IQ distribution goes in the population. It has to do with the population of this country. It has to do with the demographic balance. So roughly 200 in the age group 16-17, school leaving age, with an IQ of more than 140. This is close to a genius level, if you really think about it. The problem is that we do not know how to identify these individuals. Most of these 200, I would say, didn't even have the chance to go into elementary school. That is the problem. They are there, but we have not been able to even, we can't identify them because they haven't even entered the educational system. It is like searching for the proverbial needle in the haystack. Imagine what we could do if we could identify these 200 people in each district with an IQ of more than 140. Nobody could catch us. In the context of a viable postgraduate program, this is why one needs to educate a very large number of undergraduates. Continuing along this line of thought, one needs a bigger pool of school-leaving students from which to pick one's undergraduates. In the end, one arrives at the elementary school. This is where one always arrives. I find that thinking about education in various ways. I deal with the business of training PhD students. But I keep thinking about this problem, and whatever you do, you end up with elementary school. You end up with LKG. The problem starts there. One simply cannot afford to lose the few children who are truly exceptional, even as they remain hidden and even uneducated amongst the vast numbers of more average ability. Second, why should the screening mechanisms at every level be very efficient? This is because we would be handling the huge numbers. Unless our screening mechanisms are very efficient, the whole system would collapse under the weight of mediocrity. Efficient screening mechanisms are ruthless, discriminatory and dispassionate. The degree of ruthlessness and of discrimination increases as one moves up the educational ladder. It should increase. Today what is happening is it is decreasing as you move up the educational ladder. We are becoming more and more lenient the higher you go. We look at a kid very carefully before you admit him or her into LKG. Getting an admission into the PhD is very, very easy. At least it is in our university. I don't know how it is in other places. So easier. So you see, if something is lopsided with this, it should be very easy. It should be trivially easy to put your child into LKG. It should be quite hard to get into a PhD program. So you can see exactly. The whole thing has become ulta-pulta. The search for quality is about survival of the fittest. One must accept this and one must be comfortable with such an evolutionary model. Indeed, upper level screening in scientific research has very little to do with social engineering and pseudo-leftist or pseudo-liberal thinking. If these latter attributes are deemed to be imperative, I leave it to the politicians to decide. I am not one to decide whether those things are imperative. But if they are deemed to be imperative, then I will say one should abandon higher level science altogether. Then don't even pretend that you are doing science. Because that science higher level and all the social engineering, they have not much to do with each other. Accepting my arguments and with large numbers of students screened effectively and appropriately at all levels, one would get the golden mean of quantity at the lower levels and quality at the higher levels. Sadly, the present situation is characterized by neither quantity nor quality. In the science context, no one is really interested in a BSc degree because science as a career is not perceived as a serious option by students and their parents. Only the debris remain in the BSc program. The debris of that go into the BA program. Almost. Substandard undergraduates become substandard PhD students. No scientific institution in India, however glamorously it may be touted by the news media, has avoided this problem of deteriorating student quality. They're bad everywhere today. There were days when a small number of bright students somehow drifted into the so-called prestigious places. And there was this fig leaf of respectability. We could pretend that somehow that things were okay. Today even the pretense has gone. The rot has spread all the way to the top. Students do not want to enter a scientific career because they do not see attractive economic prospects at the end of their studies. I dare say the same situation prevails in the humanities and the social sciences. Perhaps it's even worse there. One may argue with this attitude on the part of the students, but it is unavoidable in our money-driven society today. So educationists, teachers, we have to come to grips with this. We have to make our programs relevant. We have to, because students are anxious, and times are anxious, times are difficult. I do not blame the students for being anxious. I will never tell a student, why are you not coming for a PhD? It's a very difficult program, it's a very long program, and at the end of the program we are not guaranteeing him or her any kind of economic security. And why should he or she enter the PhD program? Now, two themes. I come to two themes which need to be elaborated, and also in the context of IPE as a place where you deal more with economics, econometrics, MBA and such like. Let's treat education as a commodity And then let's analyze the various stages of the education process. If one treats education as a commodity, then one can identify three main components: the inputs, the outputs, and the technology that transforms inputs into outputs. Similarly, one can identify four stages of education: school, undergraduate study, postgraduate study, and research. Let us take each of these themes in turn. The inputs in the education venture are the students. We need the best ones in the largest possible numbers and in all the four stages of education. In the quest for the best students, it is significant to note that there should be no entry barriers at any stage, provided the student is able to maintain the quality that is required to move from one stage to the next. In other words, there should be a level playing field as far as equality of opportunity to all is concerned. I am not suggesting here that all students are equally intelligent. As I said before, native intelligence is a God-given gift. Even Mr. Arjun Singh cannot take an IQ of 80 and make him into an IQ of 140. I am only suggesting that there should be an equal opportunity for all to study, and provided the student is able to do well at the level at which she is studying, there should be an equality of opportunity to proceed to the next stage. The second job is somewhat easier, to provide equality of opportunity. But even that Mr. Arjun Singh is not able to do. The first one he cannot do. The second one he can do and he is not able to do, because the whole issue of reservations has become one of a scarcity problem. The fact is that we don't have enough places for our students, and therefore in an attempt quite correctly to advantage some of the socially depressed classes, we now have to deprive others of the seats, because the number of seats is very small. This is the main problem. The problem is not really reservations or no reservations. The problem is one of scarcity of seats. Suppose there is enough places for everybody to study whatever they want, then there will be no issue. Okay. Now let's take the technology that transforms students into finished products for society. This consists of all of us: the teachers, the education institutions, the labs, the infrastructure. By institutions, I mean the entire panoply of structures that constitutes the bureaucracy and legislation of education. This would include all the proactive measures that the government and other education providers carry out to ensure that the system performs to a maximum efficiency and output. Needless to say, this technology, the enabling technology, is not being done very well today. These institutions, by their actions and or inaction, enable or constrain this technology. Today there seems to be more of the latter. These technologies also incorporate our mechanisms of rewards and punishments. Neither rewards or punishments are we able to administer properly today. We are not able to reward properly, we are not able to punish properly. We are somewhat floating in the middle, doing neither. Therefore, criteria of accountability are taking a blow. Honesty and transparency of the entire system is now becoming compromised. Now by output, I mean the finished products of education, in other words the students, who at the end of each of the four stages should be able to make a considered choice as to whether or not to proceed to the next stage. Proceeding to the next stage should be a conscious choice made by the student. It should not be something that is forced on the student, whether to drop out or whether to continue. The most crucial determinant of a quality cum quantity based system is the presence of a decent exit option at each of the four stages. Without exit options, without decent exit options, any scheme of education in the modern world is a non-starter. There is no point in even trying to educate somebody if you do not provide an exit option. Many of the distortions in the present state of affairs, lack of dignity and self-respect of a student who quits after high school, say, the craze for an engineering degree, the flight of students from humanities, sciences and social sciences, the exodus to foreign countries either for higher studies, employment or postdoctoral research. All these stem from a single cause: lack of exit options. The government has not done anything in terms of providing these options for students. Government can hardly believe that it has done its job by suddenly creating a large number of seats in brand new but in fact non-existent institutions. That's what they are doing today. And linking these real seats in virtual institutions with caste-based reservations at the higher levels, and with not a care for what it has not done at the lower levels. This is nothing other than state legitimized lunacy. Nothing good will come out of this. This is something that all of us need to bear in mind. They are creating new institutions all right today, But these are new institutions in name only. IIT Patna exists in IIT Guwahati. IIT Indore exists in IIT Bombay. IIT Mohali exists in IIT Delhi. IIT Hyderabad is the only one which has its own campus in a gun factory. Yeah, students are coming every day, teachers are coming from Madras in an aeroplane to go to the gun factory and teach the students there. Nobody wants to join IIT Hyderabad. They are forcing the students literally to join. See, this is the writing on the wall. After 4 years, 5 years, the students will take the guns that are being made in the factory and then they will come and start teaching. This is what is happening. This is what I mean by real seats in virtual institutions. The faculty of IIT Bombay have to teach 2 sets of courses. One for IIT Bombay and one for IIT Indore, the same campus. Why call something IIT Indore? Why do you really call it IIT Indore if it is going to be located in Bombay? This is the kind of double speak, double thinking, imagining. They are living in some kind of fantasy land today. Very serious analysis of the education sector in India leads one to the conclusion that the inputs, the first of the 3 elements, are seriously flawed at the higher levels. This in turn leads one to scrutinize the preceding stage of education. Inexorably one descends into an analysis of the elementary school. Time and time again you come back to the elementary school. It is here that the facts are the most shocking. Dropout rates in government secondary schools in certain densely populated parts of rural India, notably eastern UP and Bihar, run to as much as 75%. As I mentioned earlier, the so-called needle in the haystack problem can only be addressed if vast numbers of children are able to access proper elementary coming. So after radio and television started appearing and everybody had access to it, the number of Olympics medals started going up. In other words, what I am going to suggest is perhaps many people in India do not even know what the Olympics are to want to think of a career in sports. At the enabling technology stage, we lack proper facilities and money to train athletes. That's the next step. So first at the input step we are failing because nobody knows what is the Olympics, what are the Olympics. At the second stage we do not have facilities, we do not have the money to train our athletes. At the output stage, the athletes who have somehow miraculously cleared the hurdles of the 2 first stages have to contend with the corrupt officials, so they come at the end. So the country has lost at every stage. Inputs, technology, outputs. And therefore confidently and as a scientist I can say that it is impossible for us to ever get an Olympics medal except for pure flukes like Rajyavardhan Singh Rathore, Karnam Malleshwari and more recently Abhinav Bindra who have garnered their medals despite the system and not because of the system. You know, I remember the day when Bindra got his medal, they were making a big fuss in the television channels. And in one of these English television channels, I have now come to quite dislike these English television news channels. There was this man Arnab Goswami, whom you have all seen in the TV. So he was asking Bindra's father. He was saying, Mr. Bindra, he was accusing him. He said, Mr. Bindra, tell me, how does a poor man's son win an Olympics gold medal? You had all this money, you could train your son. What does a poor man do? You know, actually I think it's a very unfair question because it is not Mr. Bindra's headache as to what a poor man can do or he cannot do. Mr. Bindra cannot be attacked for being rich. It's the government's problem. He should ask Mr. Gill, the sports minister, that question. He should ask that other guy, that Kalmedi. He should ask him that question. He should not ask Mr. Bindra that question. What does a poor man do? Mr. Bindra is rich. He could build a shooting gallery for his son. The son got the medal. Pretty good. Also, later on, 2 poor people's son got a bronze medal. There are people who are sleeping in one room with 12 people full of rats. So this is a very interesting statistic in fact. That our ratio of rich people to poor people, about 1:2 in this country, roughly corresponds to the ratio of the medals, 1:2 that we got. So rich people have to get used to the idea of poor people have to get used to the idea of rich people. We have to get used to all these things. These are all realities in our countries. I told you in the beginning, it's a complex system. It is not a simple system. And there's no point in anybody, I have seen this in the scientific side also. It is somehow believed in a vague way that a person who is born to wealth is somehow not capable of intellectual abilities. This is very sad. It is also believed, I have said it many times in meetings, it is believed that a person can become a better scientist the poorer his knowledge of English becomes. These things are, fairly popular in, higher scientific circles. We're always told in committees and so on, Arey dekho, he's not able to express himself in English properly, but if he was able to express himself, he would become a very great scientist. No, that is bullshit. Most of these people who cannot express themselves in English cannot express themselves in Telugu or Hindi or Bengali or whatever. They cannot express themselves. So don't start, coming back to sports, the fact that cricket has taken off so well in this country also reduces proof for my assertions. Cricket, especially of the ODI variety and 2020, really took off in India only after the game became popular in smaller towns. This whole idea of, at the base, at the input you have to increase it. By taking off, I mean that we actually started winning games rather than just participating. In sports, in science, wherever. You can, kid yourself all about participating and all, but really you participate to win. You don't participate just to participate and say, okay, I'm participating. Fine, okay. But we should not kid ourselves and, we want to win in all these things. But we started winning in cricket. Both Kapil Dev and Mahendra Singh Dhoni are small town boys. Gone are the days when the city of Bombay and the activities in and around Shivaji Park could dominate the game at a national level. Gone are the days when the activities within the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, can dominate the scientific scene. Imagine what would happen if cricket became a known commodity in remote villages. No one would ever be able to beat us again. The same thing can happen in education. It's a question of increasing the outreach. In the higher research context, can one therefore think of a breakthrough solution for our problems? High levels of student participation at the undergraduate level demand budgets that are much higher than what we are able to conceive of in India. China opted for this route, and they set up 100 universities each with a budget of around 100 crore per year, each handling 10,000 students. They have especially emphasized laboratory training, something we don't do at all in India, which is essential for all science education. This would amount to an outlay of rupees 10,000 crore per year, but at least 250,000 students would receive a good undergraduate degree every year, and this is no small number. I do not believe that the sum of 10,000 crore per year for undergraduate education is large, given today's realities. The Department of Atomic Energy efforts are truly subcritical, and they have been initiated in several cases with very little forethought, planning or attention to detail. Within a few months of starting the new IITs, serious lacunae and inconsistencies have surfaced with respect to their functioning, student intake and teacher shortage, to the extent that it is already feared that these new IITs will have a deleterious effect on the entire IIT system. Even that small thing, little thing we had, which was somehow working all right, it's still not very good, because 99% of the students who apply for admission to IITs are rejected. So it can't be a very good system. But whatever little we have, even that will go with these new IITs, which they are virtual places. So now I conclude. I would say that in all successful countries, quality and quantity are two sides of the same coin of excellence. Because of this almost willful neglect of both quality and quantity, willful is the operative word. We want to neglect it. Because of this willful neglect, India is paying a bitter price today in the field of education and research. Sometimes, even complex problems have simple solutions. In fact, most of the times they do. In fact, I'll tell you from a scientific analogy how scientists think about complex problems. We say that if you attempt to solve a complex problem with a thought process or a frame of reference that is suited to a simple problem, then you can't solve it. So the solution comes by changing the frame of reference to a complex frame. And once you change the frame of reference and move to a higher frame, then the solution becomes simple again. So complex problems cannot be solved by simplistic solutions of an earlier era. This works in science, and I see no reason why it will not work in the education sector. Politicians who have contributed the most to the present sorry state of affairs need to view students as potential assets for development rather than as vote banks to be exploited through the device of caste reservations. Bureaucrats need to worry less about securing their own positions through their own peculiar and self-appreciative variety of obfuscation, procrastination, and consensus-linked half measures. They are very pleased with themselves to score small debating points with each other and somehow try to, push off the situation for today. We know they are intelligent enough to know that there is a problem. They lack the guts to try to handle it. While scientists and teachers need to worry more about the exclusiveness and dignity of their profession. Today is Teachers' Day. We should think about the dignity of our profession rather than about the latest mood changes among the bureaucratic and political class. I interact with too many scientists in top administrative positions. Their main concern, their first thing they talk about is, what is Kapil Sibal's mood today? See, this is not a very good question to ask. What is he saying? What does he think? Who is Kapil Sibal finally? See, tomorrow, if they lose the election, he goes somewhere. He goes back to the Supreme Court and makes that lot of money that he used to make before he became a minister. When I find very, very senior scientists who are heading all kinds of administrative positions, worrying so much about Kapil Sibal, Manmohan Singh, Arjun Singh, this is a sorry state of affairs. Because I have interacted with senior scientists in other countries. They do not run behind the whims and fancies of politicians the way our people do. In the end, it is only the student who suffers because he or she has to make do with ad hoc solutions. Already there is disturbing evidence of what happens when one fails to read the writing on the wall. The sharp increase in coaching classes, I have talked about them. Non-accredited universities and colleges, in fact all kinds of dubious arrangements that hawk and peddle education are very common now, and indeed they are quite popular. Students don't go to regular universities and colleges, they go to all these places. Because somehow they feel that there is more in it for them. Market forces. The country is losing an enormous amount of foreign exchange in fees paid by Indian students studying abroad. Do you know the amount? It is a shocking amount. Indian students who go to foreign universities to study are paying 10 billion US dollars per annum. That is 55,000 crores per annum is being spent by Indian students to go abroad and study there. You could start all the IITs, IIMs, universities. I am only asking for 10,000 crores per year. Here is 55,000 crores which is going out of the country. Again, a system where only 1% of these fellows are getting admitted into the IITs and IIMs is not a good solution. The average fees paid per month by an IIT student is 120 US dollars per month. The same student is spending between 1,000 and 5,000 US dollars per month when he goes abroad. So something is seriously wrong here. We are neither able to give places to students. Having given them this, we charge them too little. So it is for what? And then you are saying you want to start some new IITs. Hardly likely to make a difference. The other thing about these foreign universities, it is better if we think about the entry of foreign universities into India today and properly regulate such activity rather than wait for a time when their entry becomes unavoidable and under terms and conditions that are disadvantageous to our country. I have read the documents which are released by the Communist Party of India, Marxist. The only thing they say is we won't allow foreign universities into the country. They're steady about that. But they don't realize that the time will come when we will not be able to say no. They will come in, and they will come in on terms and conditions that are very, very bad to us. Because they will not be universities like Harvard and Yale who will come to India. There are foreign universities like our coaching classes. There are many of them, and they are the only ones who want to come now. So what they will do is they will come and say, we will put an air conditioned room, you come. And the students will go to those places because they say this is a foreign one. It's not an Indian one anymore. So all these things are going to happen. To conclude, I will say we are practically in the death throes of our 60-year-long ill-fated experiment with education and research. There are many who say, well-considered and thoughtful people, who say that it is already too late to do anything meaningful. There are others who say that the system is so much beyond repair and that it must be destroyed before it can be rebuilt. They say nothing is possible with the system now, you have to destroy it completely. I will only add that what we need today are idealists rather than optimists or pessimists. An optimist is one, in my view, who refuses to recognize reality. A pessimist is one who thinks he knows it only too well.
Thank you very much, sir. It is indeed a very critical talk on education and research, especially in science in India. I now request Sri K.S. Rajshekhar Rao garu to give his presidential remarks.
Thank you all of you. We Gautam Vishwati. Dignitaries to the dais and off the dais. What a fantastic critical analysis of Indian education system focusing on the scientific process. Use some of the engineering words, input, process, output, trying to highlight what are the today world of education here. I personally believe I'm the most beneficiary sitting from a few meters away when he is speaking. Though it is a mix of political, though it is a mix of system requirements and ground reality, all of you agree that having said that, what should be our action plan, how do we move forward? Few important things which I have tried to understand and pursue. There are many, I will only find out some critical things. I was trying to touch on the progress, which is the quality and quantity. I was trying to look at the system where, take a cricket where it is out of Bombay, out of Delhi, what are the realistic results it is giving to. And they ignore so much intelligence in the rural places. I believe strongly the rural India suffers from three major characteristics. One is availability of continuous power, approach towards water itself, drinking water itself. Look at some of these, how the students take up and students come up. Other than there is a lot of system, education system and discussion why people should only go to changes